Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Let's turn to another campaign promise now by President Trump, this one on daylight savings time. Earlier this month on Truth Social, President Trump said this: the Republican Party will use its best efforts to eliminate daylight saving time, which has a small but strong constituency, but shouldn't. Daylight saving time is inconvenient and very costly to our nation. But notable that this is another topic that divides at least some Republicans. Senator Tom Cotton saying this: Congress once made daylight saving time permanent. It was so unpopular that Congress repealed it less than a year later. That is a reference to something that happened in the 1970s. But let me go back to you on this, since I know you've looked at this daylight savings time issue. Is Trump serious about this? And what is it specifically that he wants?
Well, is Trump serious about this is always a tough question to answer, because ideas come into his head seemingly on whims, and sometimes he'll surprise you by pushing them forward, but other times they seem to evaporate as soon as they arrive. And so he did go out of his way to post something about this on social media, as you mentioned, and I'm sure that he believes that it would be worth changing, and he probably wants to feel out and see how many people are also interested in the possibility of reforming it. I think that it's very much in the spirit of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, the idea that we're going to do a top-down reevaluation of all the laws and all the regulations in this country. We're not going to leave any stone unturned. And he knows that daylight saving time, and particularly switching the clock, is not popular. And so he often will take the opportunity to change something that he thinks is going to get him sort of cheap support from the American people. That's an 80% issue. I have nothing to lose here. And so it's something that he theoretically could move on. I think the question is, are there a lot of people who do benefit from the current system who haven't spoken up yet? And so as the process moves along, and as people on Capitol Hill started to debate it, I do think that there would be potentially a lot of opposition from certain corners, and then Trump probably would get cold feet if he hadn't forgotten about it already.
But I do wonder what the actual public divide on this would be if you could give people the option in front of them of permanent daylight savings time, permanent standard time, or the switching that we're engaged in right now. I mean, I'm a night owl, Kim, and so I would love permanent daylight savings time. That would mean more light at the end of the day and less light at the beginning of the day. But I grant that there are also a lot of people who are getting up and getting to the office by 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock. That's what works for their schedules. And the difficulty is that this is a zero-sum game. There is only so much daylight to go around. And so the question is just whether there's a majority for allocating more of it to the morning or more of it to the evening. And the argument that you often hear about that 1970s experiment is there were a lot of people in the north of the country, in states like Michigan, who were sending their kids out to wait for the school bus, and the sun wasn't coming up until 8:45 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and they really disliked that. And so that's the problem, is what people want is more light, and there's only so much light to go around.
I think if you actually drilled down and spoke to people and divided this question out, you'd find that what most people don't like is simply switching the clocks twice a year. And I get that that's a hassle. Although I would also note it's become much easier to do that in a day of digitization, where a lot of our phones and a lot of our appliances and cars and things automatically shift time for us. To the extent that there has been a movement to make this happen, it has been by proponents who've been wanting to get rid of standard time. And in particular, this drive was whipped on by Marco Rubio and Rick Scott, notably of Florida. Because, by the way, Florida already gets tons of sunlight, so I really don't know what they're all whining about, except for that there's a clear commercial reason behind it, which is that if you had later sunsets in the winter time, which is what would happen if you got rid of standard time, you'd have a lot more opportunity for people to stay out at bars later and go to restaurants later. So a lot of more leisure activity would arguably be beneficial for businesses in southern states in particular. And that bill, when Rubio put it forward, sailed through the Senate. It did very well. Then it hit the House. And as you said, it came up against a wall of opposition, not just from, people who were concerned about those very late dark hours in more northern climes when it comes to children. But you have to think about the other industries, farmers, construction workers, people who start their days early already and are looking at working hours longer in the dark or not being able to engage in work because it's too dark, for instance, if you are a farmer. And so it hit some real opposition in the House and came back. I think it is notable what Tom Cotton said. We did try this once back in 1973. Prior to doing it, everyone said, yeah, bring it on. Let's just change it, get rid of this whole thing. After the experiment, support for that had dropped precipitously, well below a majority of Americans. They did not like it when they actually engaged in it. So you can put me in the camp of those who it's sort of 6 of one, half dozen of another. And I kind of like the system we have at the moment. I think that, like many things in America, balances a lot of interests.
Monet, what's your bet on this? I take all of Kim's points under consideration, though bad ideas that we tried in the 1970s is a theme sometimes in Washington. Nothing stops bad ideas from coming back. So is your bet that the Republicans under Donald Trump are going to make a push for this? Do you think we will see a bill maybe added to some kind of must-pass spending package or whatnot to make a change to the way we do our clock switching in the United States?
Sure. Well, I think that we are in a moment of Florida ascendancy. Of course, President Trump is crafting his new agenda from Mar-a-Lago. He has Marco Rubio about to be nominated as Secretary of State, and Mike Waltz, a Florida congressman, is going to be his national security advisor. I do think that they have a lot of constituents. As Kim mentioned, there are business interests in their state who would love to have an additional hour of sunlight at low cost, and I think that they'll make a push for it. But I do think that as soon as this is reintroduced in the Congress, you're going to see some of these northern lawmakers come out of the woodwork in opposition. You're going to see parent groups raising the same objections that scuttled it in the 1970s. And you're going to see farmers and other folks who depend on those early sunlight hours voicing their opposition, and they'll probably have enough momentum on their side to be able to put it down. But I do think it's worth mentioning that there have been a few big failed experiments that Congress has embarked on in the history of this country. And it's not that common that things go so poorly that they're willing to actually reverse course. Prohibition is probably the biggest example of that. It lasted about 10 years and Americans decided we've had enough of that. And there was enough of opposition to say, let's go ahead and roll it back. The 55 mile per hour national speed limit, I think, is something that a lot of folks have preferred to forget even happened because it was so maddening in those 1970s years that Congress had no choice but to roll it back. And year-round daylight time is the third big example. It went so poorly when we implemented it that opposition became so extreme, as Kim mentioned, in a short period of time that they rolled it back. And so I think belonging to that class of mistakes that were so bad that Congress mustered the will to actually correct them instead of just letting them roll on, this is probably something that we shouldn't try to repeat again.
Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.